Hey everybody, this is chapter 2 of Adorno's Critique of Political Economy by Dirk Braunstein. Chapter 2 is titled The Most Important Marxist Publication on Hegel, and the headings are 1. The universal category of society as a whole, 2. The reflexive form of false objectivity, 3. My ramshackle luxury hotel. Quote, a dispute is at least permissible, because here the truth can be said. End quote. Nietzsche, Human, All Too Human. Section 1. The universal category of society as a whole. At the beginning of the, quote, short 20th century, quote, it seemed obvious that the old world was doomed. The old society, the old economy, the old political systems had, as the Chinese phrase put it, quote, lost the mandate of heaven, end quote. Humanity was waiting for an alternative. Such an alternative was familiar in 1914, end quote. The tremor unleashed by the October Revolution is difficult to overestimate. This event, Eric J. Hobsbawm notes, quote, had far more profound and global repercussions than its ancestor. For if the ideas of the French Revolution have, as is now evident, outlasted Bolshevism, the practical consequences of 1917 were far greater and more lasting than those of 1789. The October Revolution produced by far the most formidable organized revolutionary movement in modern history. Its global expansion has no parallel since the conquest of Islam in its first century, end quote. Eric Hobsbawm. In a 1967 conversation with Irving Fetcher, Ernst Bloch recounts that he and Georg Lukács, quote, both viewed the October Revolution as a fulfillment. Lukács, in an even more theological sense, back then than I, end quote. Ernst Bloch. I don't have anything by Ernst Bloch on the show. Actually, I have one piece by Ernst Bloch. It's from the Socialist Humanism Compendium, edited by Erich Fromm from the 1960s. But I have I think it's titled Marx and Marxism, like an entire book by Irving Fetcher. Irving Fetcher, if you don't know, is also he was like the doctoral advisor for Moishe Bestone. Anyway, Lukács' 1923 essay collection, History and Class Consciousness, appeared as a theoretical reaction to this upheaval that, quote, at last, end quote, had arrived. Lukács. Among others, it was addressed to the, quote, proponents of the orthodox reception of Marx within the Second International, end quote, around Karl Kautsky, a group whose, quote, dogmatism of the Marxist conception of history, end quote, had transformed this conception, quote, into an objective historical law of motion, end quote. Footnote, see Gmunder, 1985, also Behrens and Hofner, 1993. I don't know what Behrens is being referred to. If it's Diethard Behrens, I have a piece by him on this channel. And footnote. With the pathos of a, quote, freshly baked Marxist, end quote, Lukács contrasts this objectivist approach against Lukács' own theory, according to which the worker, quote, becomes aware of himself as a commodity, end quote, Lukács, insofar as he, quote, recognizes himself in his own relationships with capital, in his own relations with capital, end quote, and in doing so becomes capable of overcoming the prevailing order. Footnote, in his preface to the new edition of History and Class Consciousness, Lukács writes of, quote, the idealism and utopianism of my revolutionary messianism, end quote. A messianism whose, quote, intellectual passion, end quote, was the genesis of all his works, end footnote. Quote, the telos of world history, the redemption of humanity, is for Lukács doubtless identical with the emancipation of the proletariat in the successful world revolution, end quote. Tietz and Kesa, 2005. As was the case for many intellectuals of his time, reading history and class consciousness was a foundational educational experience for Adorno. Adorno had long been familiar with the name Lukács, claiming to have encountered the latter's 1916 The Theory of the Novel, itself, quote, a reaction to the outbreak of the First World War, unquote, during his final year of secondary school in 1921. With that early work, an outline of a philosophy of history written before his turn to Marx, Lukács sought to show how, in spite of the progressive loss of meaning in modernity, epic poetry might still lead to a rational transformation of the existing order. Even in 1958, quite some time after he had ceased being a follower of Lukács, Adorno would describe the theory of the novel as having, quote, a brilliance and profundity of conception which was quite extraordinary at the time, so much so that it set a standard for philosophical aesthetics which has been maintained ever since, end quote. Adorno. Footnote. See Adorno 2006 on the implicit critique that Adorno would later level against the theory of the novel in Adorno's aesthetic theory. See Hohendahl, 1981, end footnote. History and class consciousness is not only concerned with class consciousness, as History and Class Consciousness's title suggests, but also with the concepts of second nature, commodity fetishism, reification, and totality. Footnote, quote, Marx's theory of commodity fetishism has only been understood insufficiently in the traditions of the labor movement and of Marxism. Marx's theory of commodity fetishism plays a role neither in the theoretical considerations of Luxemburg and Kautsky, nor of Lenin. The reason for this is the agent theoretical conception of ideology, which reduces ideology to the ruling class partisanship of the scholar. It is not until Lukács's History and Class Consciousness that commodity fetishism is regarded as the quintessence of Marxism, yet this concept underwent a personification in Lukács's work. Lukács conceives of commodity fetishism as a reification of human relationships which degrades the human being to a commodity, thereby alienating it from its human essence. The proletarians who grasp their alienation discover the human core behind the reified curtain. This is the condition of possibility for which the alienated human can return to his true essence. Lukács conducts the critique of commodity fetishism on the basis of anthropological essentialism, end quote. Iber. I think it might be Christoph Iber. I'm not sure. Or Christopher Iber. Maybe Christian. I feel like it's a Chris something. See also Bachhaus, 2004. End footnote. Footnote. Recommending the, quote, chapter on reification in history and class consciousness by Lukács to Ernst Krenek. Adorno argues that it shows, quote, that the materialist method is suited to the deepest questions of philosophy. More so, I'm convinced, than the organologists of today, end quote. Letter from Adorno to Krenek, 7th of October, 1934, end footnote. Footnote. Whereas Lukács's social analysis is based on a normative conception of totality, Adorno recognizes social totality as objectively negative. As Adorno writes, quote, totality is not an affirmative but rather a critical category, end quote. End footnote. Following Marxian theory, Lukács seeks to put these concepts in the service of a renewed philosophy of practice. At the center of Lukács's social critique stands the category of the commodity. While there were commodities in antiquity, the universality of the category of the commodity in developed capitalism, a category which by now, quote, shapes the entirety of reality, end quote, is qualitatively new. As Lukács writes, quote, the commodity can only be understood in the commodity's undistorted essence when the commodity becomes the universal category of society as a whole, end quote. Lukács. Moreover, when this happens, Lukács sees the arrival of a historical moment in which a knowledge capable of fundamentally transforming reality becomes possible. After all, quote, when the commodity form has become universal, it must then also be possible to grasp the totality of reality, end quote. Scheibler. Provided that the knowing subject is itself able to adopt the commodity form and thus come to know itself. In any case, the experience of being, quote, turned into a commodity, end quote, is something which must be endured by the worker, whose, quote, immediate existence integrates him as a pure, naked object into the production process. Once this immediacy turns out to be the consequence of a multiplicity of mediations, once it becomes evident how much it presupposes, then the fetishistic forms of the commodity system begin to dissolve. In the commodity, the worker recognizes the worker's self and the worker's own relations with capital. Inasmuch as the worker is incapable in practice of raising himself above the role of object, the worker's consciousness is the self-consciousness of the commodity. The self-consciousness of the commodity. Or in other words, the worker's consciousness is the self-knowledge, the self-revelation of the capitalist society founded upon the production and exchange of commodities, end quote. If the proletariat now, quote, becomes aware of itself as a commodity, end quote, this self-knowledge already becomes practical because the proletarian recognizes the proletarian's self as, quote, identical subject-object, the subject of action, end quote, or in other words, as the actual reproducer of the social order. And all these quotes are from Lukács, by the way, History and Class Consciousness. Quote, when the worker knows himself as a commodity, the worker's knowledge is practical. That is to say, this knowledge brings about an objective structural change in the object of knowledge. That is to say, this knowledge brings about an objective structural change in the object of knowledge. In this consciousness, and through it, the special objective character of labor as a commodity, its, quote, use value, i.e. its ability to yield surplus produce, which like every use value is submerged without a trace in the quantitative exchange categories of capitalism, now awakens and becomes social reality. Social reality. The special nature of labor as a commodity, which in the absence of this consciousness acts as an unacknowledged driving wheel in the economic process, now objectifies itself by means of this consciousness. The specific nature of this kind of commodity had consisted in the fact that beneath the cloak of the thing lay a relation between men, that beneath the quantifying crust there was a qualitative living core. Now that this core is revealed, it becomes possible to recognize the fetish character of every commodity based on the commodity character of labor power. In every case we find its core, the relation between men entering into the evolution of society, end quote, Lukács. In this way, Lukács, quote, links the self-consciousness of the proletariat with perspectives which are world historical in scope, end quote, by adopting the speculative conviction, quote, that the subjectivity of the subject consists of the subject's ability to take the being in itself from what is tangible, from what opposes it as existing in itself and outside of consciousness, and to idealize this being in itself and make this being in itself conscious, making it being for itself. Sumi. I fucked that up. God damn it. In this way, Lukács, quote, links the self-consciousness of the proletariat with perspectives which are world historical in scope, end quote, by adopting the speculative conviction, quote, that the subjectivity of the subject consists of the subject's ability to take being in itself, from what is tangible, from what opposes it as existing in itself and outside of consciousness, and to idealize this being in itself, and make this being in itself conscious. Make this being in itself being for itself, so that in the end all otherness is abolished, while knowledge and certainty become identical in the sense of absolute knowledge. This Hegelian notion of progress, according to which the idea encounters itself is the progress of the world spirit at the final stage of the objective spirit, a world spirit whose rational and necessary course is world history. End quote. Doyer, 2005. According to Lukács's eschatological vision, the proletariat will necessarily precipitate the telos of history once it causes the objective appearance of second nature to fall away. However, the concept of class consciousness is already highly problematic in Lukács's work, insofar as the concept of class consciousness imputes the existence of the proletariat as a collective subject. In contrast to Marx, Lukács does not explain how proletarians become a proletariat with reference to the position of individuals relative to the means of production, but rather by borrowing Max Weber's assumption that the rationalization of the labor process would continue apace. Footnote, quote, rationality. Rationality can be understood as a central concept of the recent historical era, a period we call modernity. The concept of reification denotes the results of a miscarried, misdirected rationalization, a notion which was initially preconceived in Hegel's concept of diremption. Diremption for Hegel is a signature aspect of modernity, even though modernity is connected to the principle of self-conscious subjectivity, the bearer of which is reason. Diremption, therefore, becomes the source of the need for a philosophy which elevates reason to understanding and thereby operates under the guiding concept of reconciliation. End quote. Doyer, 2005. End footnote. Quote, the fate of the worker becomes the fate of society as a whole. Indeed, this fate must become universal, as otherwise industrialization could not develop in this direction, end quote. That is, could never become, quote, rationally mechanized, end quote. After all, the rational mechanization of the labor process, quote, depends on the emergence of the, quote, free worker who is freely able to take his labor power to market and offer it for sale as a commodity, quote, belonging to him, a thing that he, quote, possesses, end quote. End quote. Lukács. As convincing as this assumption may be, it does not itself imply, either logically or historically, that proletarians will join together and form a collective subject, which would require them to be conscious of themselves in the capitalist process of production. Lukács is only able to outline the logical synthesis of proletarians into his collective subject proletariat by postulating the Communist Party. The Communist Party is an intermediary between the two, which would consolidate class interest and convert class interest into an allegedly objective species interest. Yet the problem of, quote, the Lukácsian concept of an objective interest, is that it is ambiguous insofar as a class interest, attributed thusly, has its basis in real social relations, that is socially underpinned, while an alleged interest in emancipation requires premises from the philosophy of history and anthropology, end quote. Behrens and Hofner, 1993. Martin Blumentritt notes correctly that Lukács's version of proletarian thinking is, in fact, not at all, quote, the thinking of the proletariat, but rather of the idea of the proletariat, end quote. Martin Blumentritt. The result of the latter mode of thinking is that, quote, the practical consequence of the dictatorship of the proletariat becomes not the proletarianization of the state, but rather the nationalization of the proletariat, end quote. Blumentritt, 1992. Section 2. The reflexive form of false objectivity. Second nature, a, quote, extremely important concept, unquote, for Adorno, and one which Lukács himself adopts from Hegel, is already employed by Lukács in the theory of the novel. Footnote. In section 4 of Hegel's Elements of the Philosophy of Right, second nature is described thusly, quote, the basis, bracket, Boden, end bracket, of right is the realm of spirit in general, and its precise location and point of departure is the will. The will is free. So that freedom constitutes the will's substance and destiny, bracket, Bestimmung, end bracket, and the system of right is the realm of actualized freedom. The world of spirit produced from within itself as a second nature, end quote. Hegel. See also Doyer, 2005, end footnote. Here, in Lukács' The Theory of the Novel, second nature refers to a social construct which appears natural. Second nature is the, quote, world of things created by man yet lost to him, end quote. Lukács. Footnote. As Lukács writes, quote, the second nature, the nature of man-made structures, has no lyrical substantiality. The second nature, the nature of man-made structures, forms are too rigid to adapt themselves to the symbol-creating moment. The content of the second nature, precipitated by its own laws, is too definite to be able to rid itself of those elements which, in lyric poetry, are bound to become essayistic. Furthermore, these elements are so much at the mercy of laws, are so absolutely devoid of any sensuous valency of existence independent from laws, that without them they can only degenerate into nothingness. This second nature is not dumb, sensuous, and yet senseless like the first. This second nature is a complex of senses, meanings, which has become rigid and strange, and which no longer awakens interiority. It is a charnel house of long-dead interiorities. This second nature could only be brought to life, if this were possible, by the metaphysical act of reawakening the souls which, in an earlier ideal existence, created or preserved it. It can never be animated by another interiority, end quote. Lukács. End footnote. And I misquoted that last thing where it says, the last sentence that said, here it refers to, second nature refers to a social construct which appears natural. Second nature is the, quote, world of things created by man yet lost to man, end quote. Is from Adorno, not Lukács. In History and Class Consciousness, this concept of second nature is further developed into a description of the modern state of society in which, quote, on the one hand, men are constantly smashing, replacing, and leaving behind them the, quote, natural, end quote, irrational and actually existing bonds, while, on the other hand, men erect around themselves, in the reality they have created and, quote, made, a kind of second nature, which evolves with exactly the same inexorable necessity as was the case earlier on with irrational forces of nature. More exactly, the social relations which appear in this form, end quote. Lukács, History and Class Consciousness. Footnote. Together with Horkheimer, Adorno would later produce an analysis in Dialectic of Enlightenment, which goes back even further, all the way back to prehistory, in order to use pre-social or mythical relationships between nature and humans to decipher social relations themselves. End footnote. Already from his reading of history and class consciousness, Adorno derives the idea of the Selbstbeherrschung of the modern individual, a term which can be translated into English as self-control or self-mastery, but also as self-domination. This idea of self-domination constitutes a highly important insight for the further development of Adorno's critical theory. Judging by the handwritten comments, and underlining in his copy of History and Class Consciousness, Adorno evidently studied the following longer passages especially intensively. Quote, "What is of central importance, in the case of the basic phenomenon of reification, is that, a man's own activity, a man's own labor becomes something objective and independent of that man. Something that controls that man by virtue of an autonomy alien to man. There is both an objective and a subjective side to this phenomenon. Objectively, a world of objects and relations between things springs into being, the world of commodities and commodities' movements on the market. The laws governing these objects are indeed gradually discovered by man, but even so, the laws governing these objects confront man as invisible forces that generate their own power. The individual can use his knowledge of these laws to his own advantage, but the individual is not able to modify the process by the individual's own activity. Subjectively, where the market economy has been fully developed, a man's activity becomes estranged from himself. A man's activity turns into a commodity which, subject to the non-human objectivity of the natural laws of society, must go its own way independent of man, just like any consumer article. Quote, what is characteristic of the capitalist age, end quote, says Marx, quote, is that in the eyes of the laborer himself, labor power assumes the form of a commodity belonging to him. On the other hand, it is only at this moment that the commodity form of the products of labor become general, end quote. Marx, end quote. Lukács, History and Class Consciousness. That was a phenomenal quote. I like that a lot. I'm copying it down. Sorry for this dead air. I hope you can find it in your little soul to forgive me. How's your mom? Is she good? What about your father? Is he also good? I hope he's good. I also hope your mom is well. Alright, done that. Okay. Back to the text. God, I'm funny. You guys think I'm funny? I'm funny. I'm the funniest person ever. Why am I so hilarious? In a margin next to this passage, Adorno notes that, quote, man, quote, dominates himself. Quote, revolutionary lack of restraint, initially, albeit incorrectly, yields the commodity character of one's own productivity, end quote. Adorno. For Adorno, the submission of human beings to society's so-called natural laws, that is, to a compulsion which humans themselves have created, is the decisive element in Lukács' analysis of the all-encompassing process by which they are, quote, turned into a commodity, end quote. Lukács's analysis continues as follows, quote, the universality of the commodity form is responsible, both objectively and subjectively, for the abstraction of the human labor incorporated in commodities. Parenthesis. On the other hand, this universality becomes historically possible because this process of abstraction has been completed, in parenthesis. Objectively, insofar as the commodity form facilitates the equal exchange of qualitatively different products, the commodity form can only exist if that formula quality is in fact recognized, at any rate in this relation, which indeed confers upon them their commodity nature. Subjectively, this formula quality of human labor in the abstract is not only the common factor to which the various commodities are reduced, it also becomes the real principle governing the actual production of commodities. Clearly, it cannot be our aim here to describe even in outline the growth of the modern process of labor, of the isolated, quote, free labor and the division of labor. Here we need only establish that labor, abstract, equal, comparable labor, measurable with increasing precision according to the time socially necessary for its accomplishment, the labor of the capitalist division of labor, existing both as the presupposition and the product of capitalist production, is born only in the course of the development of the capitalist system. Only then does it become a category of society, influencing decisively the objective form of things and people in the society thus emerging, their relation to nature and the possible relations of men to each other, end quote. Lukács. In this passage, Lukács, of course, does not pursue, quote, in detail, as Marx does in Capital, how the money form develops as the result of viewing the commodity analytically, end quote, but rather, quote, establishes as a basic insight in its own right that the, quote, commodity form, end quote, must be viewed as a, quote, formal equality, end quote, which emerges from the abstracting reduction of heterogeneous qualities into undifferentiated abstract labor, end quote. Donna Mann, 1997. That being said, in view of Adorno's future deployment of the concept of reification, Lukács's last two sentences do appear programmatic, if only the sections underlined by Adorno are read. Quote, here we need, bracket 2, and bracket, establish that labor, measurable, according to the time socially necessary for its accomplishment, becomes a category of society influencing decisively the objective forms of things and people in the society thus emerging, end quote. Adorno. Yet Adorno has a correspondingly more thorough, which is to say, more radical grasp of the implications of reification than Lukács. Quote, the commodity form as total reification, including of knowledge and of the subject, renders the general forms of consciousness problematic. In contrast to Lukács's account, consciousness and subjectivity do not have to adhere to their own objective, albeit alienated essence and interest for society to nevertheless ultimately arrive at a definitively rational reason. For Adorno, the subjectivity and reason must turn against themselves directly, carry out subjectivity and reason's own critique, end quote. Engster, 2006. I have a piece by Frank Engster on this channel. Anyway, various authors take the problem of reification as the center of their social critiques. However, in negative dialectics, Adorno himself rejects any theorist who imagines that, quote, in the dissolution of reification, of the bracket commodity character, end bracket, He possesses the philosopher's stone, end quote. After all, quote, reification itself is the reflexive form of false objectivity. Centering theory around reification, a form of consciousness, makes the critical theory idealistically acceptable to the reigning consciousness and to the collective unconscious. That is what raised Marx's early writings, in contradistinction to Das Kapital, to Marx's early writings' present popularity, notably with theologians. Yeah, there's a big reading by theologians of the early texts of Marx in the post-war period. Anyway, there is a good deal of irony in the fact that the brutal and primitive functionaries who more than 40 years back damned Lukács as a heretic because of the reification chapter in his important History and Class Consciousness did sense the idealistic nature of Lukács' conception. We can no more reduce dialectics to reification than we can reduce dialectics to any other isolated category, however polemical. The cause of human suffering, meanwhile, will be glossed over rather than denounced in the lament about reification. The trouble is with the conditions that condemn mankind to impotence and apathy, and would yet be changeable by human action. It is not primarily with people, and with the way conditions appear to people. Considering the possibility of total disaster, reification is an epiphenomenon, and even more so is the alienation coupled with this reification, the subjective state of consciousness that corresponds to it. End quote. Adorno. Here it can be seen that Adorno does not in fact take up the concept of, quote, the authentic individual, end quote, but rather, quote, holds alienation and reification as unsuitable concepts for a critical theory of society, end quote, and, quote, attacks philosophical concentration on alienation and reification as a fashionable ideology, susceptible to religious usage, the cult of the works of the young Marx at the expense of capital, anthropocentric conceptions of history, and the emollient rhetoric of humanism accompanying them. As Adorno warns in a letter to Wilhelm Alf, quote, one has to be careful in turning, quote, to the young Marx, end quote. It is no coincidence and not due to forgetfulness that Marx and Marx's later development no longer expressly referred back to humanism, but instead completely remolded the, quote, anthropological, end quote, concepts into economic dialectical concepts, and did not crystallize something like a positive doctrine of the right life. I'm the last to fail to recognize that within this development itself, like quite dubious elements which find their expression in things such as the fetishization of products and similar Russian abominations. But for all that, the young Marx is too popular among the religious socialists and those who believe that socialism has to be given a, quote, meaning, which then always simply amounts to ideology. I'm sure you know what I mean, end quote. Adorno. Letter from Adorno to Wilhelm Alf, 29th of August, 1951. End footnote. However, from Adorno's reading of History and Class Consciousness, Adorno not only adopts the originally Hegelian conceptions of totality, reification, and second nature, but also picks up a certain imprecision in Adorno's use of Marxist terminology. Such imprecision can be seen when Lukács identifies the, quote, transformation of labor into a commodity, end quote, as the cause of the removal of, quote, every, quote, human element from the immediate existence of the proletariat, end quote. In one passage, only to shortly thereafter portray the worker himself as, quote, commodity, as, at best the mechanical driving wheel in the machine, end quote, Lukács, of uninterrupted social reproduction. It bears noting It bears noting that the claim that the worker turns into a commodity can be seen as deriving from an early formulation of Marx and Engels. Quote, in the words of the Communist Manifesto, quote, these laborers who must sell themselves piecemeal are a commodity like every other article of commerce, end quote, end quote. Marx and Engels, Communist Manifesto. End quote, Communist Manifesto, end quote, Lukács' History and Class Consciousness. However, as Thomas Kaczynski correctly comments, if this assessment from the manifesto is valid, then, quote, either labor or the worker would need to be sold, end quote. Whereas, as Marx would later demonstrate in Marx's Critique of Political Economy, quote, neither in fact occurs, end quote. Rather, it is labor power, which becomes a commodity under capital. Thus, if the worker really does, quote, see through, end quote, himself or his labor, or both simultaneously, as Lukács anticipates, he actually crassly misunderstands economic reality, precisely because he does not see the fundamental mediation between labor and capital, which is found on the exchange of the commodity of labor power for wages. Quote, Lukács' reckless use of the expression, quote, the commodity of labor, end quote, and Lukács' implicit equation of it with the expression, quote, the commodity of labor power, end quote, shows that Lukács is apparently unable to understand Marx's distinction between the substance and the economic form of labor, and is thus unable to define the specific character of the capitalist production of commodities with respect to reification in the Marxian sense, end quote. Tietz and Kesa, 2005. According to Doyer, quote, Lukács' susceptibility to the concept of reification has its basis in the fact that Lukács largely ignores the Marxian ... analysis of the value form, end quote. Doyer, 2005. End footnote. Section 3. My Ramshackle Luxury Hotel. Adorno's rejection of Lukács, Adorno's development, as Martin J. put it, into Lukács', quote, most radical antipode, end quote, began in the spring of 1925, while living in Vienna to study composition with Alban Berg. His music's very good if you're interested in that kind of thing. Adorno had a lengthy encounter with the, quote, Marxist thinker Lukács, whom, as you know, end quote, Adorno writes in a letter to Berg, quote, I greatly revere, end quote. However, their conversation ended for Adorno in disillusionment, presumably in the most literal sense of the word. Quote, in intellectual terms, communication proved impossible, which of course pained me particularly in the case of Lukács, who has had a more profound intellectual influence on me than almost anyone else, end quote. Adorno. Letter from Adorno to Alban Berg, 21st of June 1925. End footnote. In a letter to Siegfried Krakauer, written shortly after the meeting, Adorno gives a more detailed account of the content of his discussion with Lukács. Quote, I sensed at once that Lukács was beyond any kind of possible human relationship, and so I too behaved accordingly and maintained a certain reserve during our conversation, which lasted over 3 hours. Our exchange, therefore, assumed the form of an interview rather than a conversation. ... First of all, Lukács roundly disavowed the theory of the novel, saying that the theory of the novel was, quote, idealistic and mythological, end quote. Lukács contrasted the theory of the novel with the, quote, conversion into content, end quote, of history by means of Marxist dialectics. To my objection that this too was idealism, a criticism which Lukács did not understand properly, Lukács retorted that 1. It was precisely by means of dialectics that the object was, quote, included and created in the object's nature of being in and for itself, end quote. Something which I shall never comprehend. 2. Nature would only be perceptible in a, quote, classless society, end quote. ... Lukács declared himself in favor of Feuerbach's anthropomorphism, which left only because Hegel's, quote, logic of appearances, end quote, out of consideration, i.e., his claim that because God had operated as a historical entity, he was real, parenthesis, terrible, exclamation point, in parenthesis, ... Lukács did shock me at one point when Lukács declared to me that in his conflict with the Third International, his opponents were in the right in actual terms, and in dialectical terms, all that was required of Lukács was an absolute approach to dialectics. Lukács' human greatness and tragedy, and the tragedy of her reversal of fortune, are rooted in this nonsensical error, end quote. Adorno. Letter from Adorno to Siegfried Kracauer, 17th to the 18th of June, 1925. Adorno and Kracauer, see Adorno and Kracauer 2020. In a subsequent letter to Kracauer, Adorno expresses his, quote, annoyance with Lukács, end quote. Letter from Adorno to Kracauer, 29th of June, 1925. Bracket Adorno and Kracauer 2020, in bracket. Following the meeting, which a letter from the following year shows was not their only one, therein Adorno reports that he had, quote, 2 conversations with Lukács, for whom I wrung a lot, which does not take much effort, however. Conversation without brilliance, how bored you would have been, end quote. Letter from Adorno to Kracauer, 4th of May, 1926. Bracket Adorno and Kracauer 2020, in bracket. A, quote, small Lukács archive, end quote, set up by Adorno and consisting of, quote, drafts of dramas by Lukács and of lecture notebooks, of letters from Paul Ernst, of piano receipts, library loan slips, and letters from landladies, as well as pre-World War love letters, end quote. Benzeler et al., 1970. Also likely dates from this period. In another letter to Kracauer, composed some years later, Adorno writes upon rereading History and Class Consciousness that the book had, quote, leaves a shocking number of loose ends and diffuses a kind of Heidelberg local color in an umbrella fashion. It is only a step to bracket Karl and bracket Mannheim, most of all in the wholly abstract conception of the concept of ideology, which cannot be handled in this schematic way of deducing it in idealistic terms. In spite of this, there are a few outstanding passages in the work. These days, though, we had advanced a considerable way beyond that, end quote. Letter from Adorno to Kracauer, 12th of May, 1930. End footnote. Adorno takes particular issue with, quote, the idea of a dialectic which is immanent within, quote, the object itself, and has a correspondingly transsubjective character, end quote. Tertullian, 2005. Adorno would later maintain that, quote, primacy of the object, end quote, is possible, quote, only in dialectics, end quote. Dialectics is not a thing in itself, and neither is the category of mediation. While the, quote, possibility of a negative dialectics depends on the proof of the primacy of the object, end quote. This proof, quote, cannot be an absolute principle for dialectics or a reprise for naive realism. It is valid exclusively in the interrelationship. If the primacy of the object were to break free of the dialectic and be positively postulated, accompanied by the triumphant howls of the complicit, then philosophy would regress to the fatuous dogma of the reproduction or reflection bracket, of reality in bracket, that we see in the late writings of Georg Lukács, end quote. Adorno, brackets in original. In any case, already in Adorno and Lukács's conversation, personal aversions and theoretical differences emerge which would never again be overcome. Here one can discern not only, quote, the germ of Lukács's future rejection of ontological realism, end quote, but also Adorno's recurring, quote, critique of Lukács's, quote, party conformism, end quote, end quote. Müller-Düm, 2000. Müller-Düm is like the big biography on Adorno. Footnote. See also J, 1984. Adorno would later write that Lukács, quote, took the crudest criticisms from the party hierarchy to heart, twisting Hegelian motifs and turning those Hegelian motifs against himself. And for decades on end, Lukács labored in a series of books and essays to adapt Lukács's obviously unimpaired talents to the unrelieved sterility of Soviet claptrap, end quote. Adorno. End footnote. As late as his course, Lectures on Negative Dialectics, from the winter of 1965 to 66, Adorno brings up his encounter with Lukács to clarify the differences between their respective positions. Quote, this mechanism of coercion binds subjectivity and thought into the objectivity that stands opposed to it. In view of this dependency and of what we might call the logic of the facts, a logic that leads to the triumph of objectivity, it is not obvious why an insight into this mechanism should mean that this objectivity must itself be in the right. The situation suggests pangs of conscience imposed from outside. This is something I experienced most tellingly in my dealings with a Hegelian Marxist in my youth, namely Georg Lukács, who at the time had just quarreled with his party. In connection with that, Lukács explained to me that the party was in the right, even though Lukács's ideas and arguments were better than the party's. The party was in the right because the party embodied the objective state of history, while Lukács's own position, which was more advanced both in Lukács's view and in terms of sheer logic of the ideas involved, lagged behind that objective state of affairs. I believe that I do not have to spell out for you the implications of such a statement. It would imply simply that with the assistance of the dialectic, whatever has greater success, whatever comes to prevail, to be generally accepted, has a higher degree of truth than the consciousness that can see through its fraudulent nature. In actual fact, ideology in the Eastern Bloc is largely determined by this idea. A further implication is that mind would amputate itself, that it would abdicate its own freedom and simply adapt to the needs of the big battalions. Bracket, sich einfach an die stärkeren Bataillone anpasst, in bracket. To accept such a course of action does not appear possible to me. End quote. Adorno. Footnote. Adorno's allegation that Lukács's philosophy, quote, sides with the big guns, end quote. Bracket, marschiert mit den stärkeren Bataillonen, in bracket, is already contained in Hegel, 3 Studies. There, Adorno alleges that Lukács revives, quote, one of Hegel's most dubious theses, that of the rationality of the real, end quote. Adorno. Thereby adopting, quote, the judgment of a reality that always destroys what could be different, end quote. Adorno. End footnote. Here, Lukács appears as an apologist for the Hegelian understanding of history, as well as for the process by which the universal asserts itself at the expense of the particular, the identical at the expense of the non-identical. In turn, Lukács strikes back against Adorno with a praxis philosopher's scorn in the 1963 reissue of The Theory of the Novel. In its new preface, Lukács accuses Adorno, the intellectual who maintains, quote, that a theory is much more capable of having practical consequences owing to the strength of that theory's own objectivity than if it had subjected itself to praxis from the start, end quote. Of having, quote, taken up residence in the, quote, Grand Hotel Abyss, end quote, ... a beautiful hotel equipped with every comfort on the edge of an abyss of nothingness, of absurdity, and the daily contemplation of the abyss between excellent meals or artistic entertainments can only heighten the enjoyment of the subtle comforts offered, end quote. Lukács. Here, Lukács appears as an apologist for the Hegelian understanding of history. Sorry, reading from the wrong spot. Unsurprisingly upset by this, Adorno writes to Krakow that Lukács, quote, blackens my name in the most ridiculous and servile fashion by calling me a nihilist, end quote. Adorno. Footnote. Following his death, Adorno was again accused of choosing nihilism over hope, this time from Ernst Bloch. Quote, there's been enough nihilism from Adorno. Adorno may pay lip service to hope, but that alone doesn't paint a positive picture, end quote. Ernst Bloch. End footnote. Quote, well, where should I live? End quote. Adorno asks in a subsequent note. Quote, in the must of shelteredness? I'd prefer that to my ramshackle luxury hotel. Its luxury is nothing other than happiness in articulating the utmost negativity, and one is begrudged even that, end quote. Adorno. Adorno's polemical invocation of shelteredness, a word which, after the events to which history had just borne witness, Adorno regards as obsolete and even obscene, alludes to Heidegger's notion of fundamental ontology, which Adorno accuses Lukács of having appropriated as early as his 1949 essay titled Heidegger Redivius. For Adorno, quote, Heidegger Redivivus, I said it wrong, Redivivus, defames, quote, the attempt to mediate between subject and object, the core of all dialectics, and a core which is most certainly taken up by Marxian dialectic, end quote. Dialectics, end quote. Adorno, and relapses, quote, into reified consciousness out of fear of ontology, end quote. Adorno. Lukács' critique, Adorno claims, constitutes, quote, a textbook case of the inadequacy of transcendental critique, end quote, because it must first adopt a normative standpoint. In this case, that, quote, an idealist thinks being is brought forth by consciousness, end quote, whereas dialectical materialism, in keeping with its maxims, assumes, quote, that being has priority over consciousness. Quote, that being has priority over consciousness, end quote. With this one-sided decision in favor of the primacy of being having been made in advance, the dialectical mediation between being and consciousness, which is only made comprehensible by theory, is replaced by a simple choice between materialism or idealism. According to Adorno, to completely and fully side with the objective while discounting the subjective as peripheral is simultaneously, quote, to mock the dialectical principle itself, because without a subject, without an element of reflection and negativity, discourse on the dialectical process becomes hopelessly entangled, end quote. There's some footnotes that I missed. Footnote. As Adorno notes, quote, the Marxian theory that being has priority over consciousness precisely does not want to be understood ontologically, but rather as an expression of a negative, namely of the supremacy of reification, of the relations of production into which human beings, quote, enter involuntarily, end quote. Adorno. End footnote. Footnote. The relevant passage from Lukács reads as follows, quote, we know Heidegger and Heidegger's followers would above all protest vehemently against the label of idealism here. Yet Heidegger keeps claiming to be neither idealist nor materialist, but rather to have discovered a relationship to being which stands beyond this alleged dilemma. What Heidegger consistently means by this dilemma is the clear, sharp, and correct Hegelian juxtaposition. A materialist believes that being has priority over consciousness. An idealist thinks being is brought forth by consciousness. End quote. Lukács. End footnote. Given that Lukács lacks such an element of negativity, Adorno argues, Lukács falls victim to an originary philosophy. Parenthesis, Ursprungsphilosophie. In parenthesis. Or, in other words, to quote, precisely the very reified thinking to which he once dedicated such vivid analyses in history and class consciousness, end quote. Almost as if, quote, the discourse on dialectics within Marxism were not at all meant to be taken seriously. Indeed, any attempt to view the relationship between subject and object dialectically, the only possible method to move beyond philosophical reification, theoretically, is banished, end quote. Adorno. Adorno sees Lukács's formerly unorthodox Marxism as having been betrayed to official party Diamant, parenthesis, the Stalinist abbreviation for dialectical materialism, end parenthesis, which with objective problems being decided from above to benefit a doctrine rather than thought through. Footnote. Adorno becomes more explicit at the end of his note, titled Ad Lukács, when Adorno criticizes the language of Lukács' essay on Heidegger. Quote, when Lukács quite rightly counters the blown-out lie about the authenticity of youth, that abhorrent residue of the youth movement which still haunts Heidegger's solemn expectorations. He says of the young Germans who participated in Hitler's military campaign that they, quote, in the best case were witnesses, passive participants in the plunder and murder, the rapes of women and children, etc. on the part of Hitler's army, ... End quote. The, quote, best case, end quote, is a bloody joke. The, quote, etc. after the, quote, rapes, however, followed by the bureaucratic, quote, on the part of, end quote, does conceptually to the victims through the inhumanity of discourse yet again what the fascist hordes committed in reality. It's a matter of whether the atrocities perpetrated by the German army exceeded what militarism brings about everywhere, pending on the beheading of the last marshal, but it is telling that Lukács' outrage limits itself to the army without referring to the SS, which carried out the most gruesome work, or to the extermination camps. Lukács is allowed to speak out against the Wehrmacht precisely because it was the enemy of the Red Army, yet the security service is taboo, lest one stumbles upon subversive analogies, end quote. Adorno. End footnote. For Adorno, Lukács has come to embody, quote, the incarnation of a theoretical regression, following the conforming of his thought to the demands of communist orthodoxy, end quote. Adorno. Excuse me, that last quote was actually from Tertullian. Following the publication of Lukács's book, The Young Hegel, in 1948, Adorno writes of his evidently irrevocable disappointment with the young Hegel's author in a letter to Thomas Mann. Footnote: while on a ship to New York, Horkheimer wrote the following to Adorno in Europe regarding the young Hegel. Quote, "Yet the people have the same hard faces. I don't think this changes with the form of society. People have to coerce people to coerce nature. Otherwise, nature coerces people. This is the concept of society. Our specific task is to recognize it precisely in its contingency without positing spirit like Hegel. Critique of sociology is critique of the entire concept of society, to which all have been beholden since Hegel, even the, quote, good Europeans," end quote. The narrow-mindedness of Lukács's book consists in its complete reduction of Hegel to this concept. Yet with all of that, one has the feeling that society in the concise sense has been played out today. What everyone understands by it actually doesn't exist at all anymore. It exists as little as Europe does. As society elevated itself to a science, society disappeared with science, but the coercion has remained," end quote. Letter from Horkheimer to Adorno, 8th of May, 1949. End footnote. Quote, and this is the letter to Thomas Mann. Quote, "I am afraid I must regard Lukács's big book on Hegel, which I have worked through from beginning to end, as among my most depressing recent experiences. One can hardly credit such reification of consciousness in the very man who coined this concept in the first place. Heidegger's essay in Off the Beaten Track on the phenomenology of spirit is almost dialectical by comparison." End quote. Adorno. Footnote. Letter from Adorno to Mann, 3rd of June 1950. In his lecture course, Ontology and Dialectics from 1960 to 1961, Adorno brings up Heidegger's objectivism, which Adorno argues, quote, effectively neutralizes the subject, end quote. Having done so, Adorno continues, this objectivism, quote, has led to a situation in which all of these aspects which originally provoked such interest in this philosophy now have completely retreated into the background. Hence his thinking profits to this day from a certain interest, namely the interest in responding to essential questions, which it has actually long since ceased to respond to them. There is something very peculiar here which reveals a strange cultural and historical parallel with another figure who is radically opposed to Heidegger and yet in several respects not entirely unlike Heidegger. I am talking about Lukács, who in all work from around 1925 onward, if not slightly earlier, has completely retracted and repudiated all the things to which Lukács owes his intellectual reputation. Yet this turn has done nothing to damage this reputation. On the contrary, the reputation has now been transferred to products which no longer justify anything of the kind, end quote. Adorno, lecture course Ontology and Dialectics from 1960 to 61. End footnote. On the same topic, Adorno expresses himself more harshly in a letter to Peter von Haselberg. Quote, ad vocem dialectics. So it is that there are indeed now two more or less official statements from the communist and fascist wings. From Lukács, the tome on the young Hegel, rubbish in which the essential achievements of the young Hegel are depicted as his exerting of bracket James and bracket Stewart and Adam Smith, and which otherwise oscillates between the party bureaucratic necessity of reclaiming Hegel as a great man and the equally official necessity of identifying Hegel with having been refuted by Marx and refuting him again and without any grace, Compared with this, Heidegger's chapter in Off the Beaten Track at least displays the rigorous exertion of the concept, parenthesis, Anstrengung des Begriffs, and parenthesis, even though the appraisal of Hegel as an ontologist is just as nonsensical as the attempt to construe the economic motif as Hegel's central motif. End quote. Adorno. Letter from Adorno to von Haselberg, 23rd of May, 1950. The aptness of Adorno's classification of Heidegger is supported by a letter from 1966 in which Heidegger complains about, quote, Wiesengrund Adorno, unquote, having undertaken to, quote, smear me, end quote. The recipient of this letter, Ernst Junger, would have understood what Heidegger was implying here. For his own part, Adorno responded to anti-Semitism of this sort with remarkable composure. Quote, when one adds my name to my name, Adorno, the name Wiesengrund, which I went by earlier, that may well be meant anti-Semitically, but I myself have never denied my previous name. I took the maiden name of my mother only because the other was unpronounceable in America. And I can't bring myself to take offense at being called by my father's name, end quote. Letter from Adorno to Hans Naumann, 22nd of November, 1955. End footnote. Yeah, it's interesting there, like when people, one of the things that the Stalinists also did in the Soviet Union in their battle with the left opposition is use the birth names of a lot of people as opposed to their nom de guerre. So, for instance, Trotsky, Lev Braunstein, as opposed to Trotsky. Anyway, that's just a side note for myself. End footnote. In a report produced for Horkheimer, upon reading the young Hegel, Adorno draws the following conclusion, quote, Lukács sees himself faced with double necessity of both having to appropriate, quote, the great thinker, Hegel, directly for economic materialism, and because Marx refuted him, having to refute him again. Thus, good and bad marks are given to Hegel alternately. However, out of fear of the mandarins, bracket, i.e. the party functionaries, in bracket, Lukács doesn't dare to search for the materialist motifs in Hegel's logic and metaphysics themselves, but rather clings to that which is more or less exerted from classical national economy, and is overjoyed when the application of the dialectical method in the subject area of economy occasionally yields results which are reminiscent of Marx and Engels. End quote. Adorno. Footnote. According to the Theodore W. Adorno Archive, the untitled two-page typescript was written in 1949 or at the beginning of 1950. On this report, see also Tertullian, 1984. The problem is reprinted in its entirety in Braunstein and Durkheim. I just realized the similarity between Braunstein and Braunstein, Trotsky's name. Interesting. End footnote. Footnote. In 1950, Adorno writes to Hermann Lübbe about Lukács's, quote, schoolmasterly verbosity, end quote. Quote, the content of the whole tome, bracket, the young Hegel, end bracket, which I've read through from start to finish, could have been presented comfortably in a 40-page journal article if Mr. Lukács didn't need to stage such a delicate performance, parenthesis, irritants, in parenthesis, to avoid losing his head over some of those statements, end quote. Letter from Adorno to Hermann Lübbe, 18th of January 1955. End footnote. Lukács's 1954 book, The Destruction of Reason, also played a significant role in the dispute between Lukács and Adorno, who claimed it was actually a crass manifestation of, quote, the destruction of Lukács's own, end quote. I guess Lukács's own reason? That's what that means. Footnote. Adorno. Footnote. Among other things, this work portrays Nietzsche as the, quote, founder of irrationalism in the imperialist period, end quote. As Lukács argues, quote, what determined Nietzsche's particular position in the development of modern irrationalism was partly the historical situation at the time of Nietzsche's appearance, end quote. Something doubtless true of every theoretical position. Quote, and partly his unusual personal gifts, end quote. From this specific, quote, historical situation, end quote, arose for Nietzsche, quote, a favorable opportunity to conjecture and to solve in mythical form on the reactionary bourgeoisie's terms the main problems of the subsequent period, end quote. Yet here Lukács disregards the fact that Nietzsche could only become the, quote, leading philosopher, end quote, of reaction, because reaction distorted him into his opposite, misconstruing him as its prophet and even as an intellectual precursor of National Socialism. According to Adorno, rather than side with Nietzsche, who is horrified by folkish Germanness and anti-Semitism, Lukács refers to him, quote, in the condescending tones of provincial Wilhelminian school inspector as a man, quote, above average abilities, end quote. Under the mantle of an ostensibly radical critique of society, Lukács surreptitiously reintroduced the most threadbare cliches of the very conformism which that social criticism had once attacked, end quote. Adorno. Footnote. See, for example, the following note from late in Nietzsche's life, quote, ah, what a relief a Jew is among German horned cattle, ... The Messieurs anti-Semites underestimate this. What actually distinguishes a Jew from an anti-Semite, the Jew knows that he lies. When he lies, the anti-Semite doesn't know that he always lies, end quote. Nietzsche. End footnote. Thus Nietzsche is portrayed as possessing a not insignificant gift, only to immediately thereafter and all the more resolutely be grouped together with those against whom he consistently, albeit unsuccessfully, philosophized throughout his entire life. Quote, apparently 19th century intellectual history only knows two kinds of poets and thinkers, end quote, writes Henning Ottoman in his critique of Lukács's Nietzsche critique. Quote, the apologists for capitalism on the one hand and the followers of socialism on the other, end quote. Henning Ottoman, Henning Ottman is the name. Because Lukács is, quote, blind for dialectical reversals, end quote, in this matter, Lukács must systematically counterpose Nietzsche to reason, which for its own part is viewed as, quote, shining in the bright light of democracy and progress, end quote. Ottman. Footnote. In a posthumous work from the Materials for the Destruction of Reason, Lukács defends the thinkers, quote, of the unstoppability of human progress, end quote, against Nietzsche's concept of history. End footnote. When Lucien Goldmann asks Adorno at the beginning of the 1960s why Adorno is so intent on attacking Lukács, given their quite similar positions, Adorno responds as follows, quote, regarding the person of Lukács, it was not I who first directed a sharp attack against him, but rather Lukács who attacked and distorted me simultaneously. If you take a look at my long essay from the second volume of Notes to Literature, titled Reconciliation Under Duress, you will see expressed my respect for the works of his, which you also esteem highly, and you will realize that I afford this respect to Lukács as a person. Of course, this cannot change the fact that I regard Lukács' later works, and above all the book, The Destruction of Reason, as pure rubbish, and I can't imagine that we wouldn't agree here. Yet I think that these works, you'll understand what I mean, have retroactive power and also subtly affect much of the early works. The concept of the meaningful era, which summarily disregards, from the elevated vantage point of his philosophy of history, all of humanity's suffering in periods of closed society, is already in a way the model of what, even in his orthodox communist phase, can most fittingly be called right-wing Hegelianism. I do not exaggerate when I tell you that my experience of Lukács' early writings, above all of his theory of the novel, essentially brought me to philosophy, and I will certainly never forget that about Lukács. But on the other hand, the limits of these works are showing themselves quite clearly today. In the novel theory, the romantic laudatio temporis acta, in history and class consciousness, the metaphysical glorification of the party as the world's spirit, end quote. Adorno. Letter from Adorno to Lucien Goldmann, 15th of October, 1963, end footnote. In later years, the significance of history and class consciousness for Adorno would become entirely historical. In his lecture course titled Fragen der Dialektik, Questions for Dialectics, from the winter semester of 1963-4, Adorno refers to history and class consciousness as, quote, the most important Marxist publication on Hegel, end quote. Quote, it is, and this chapter is quite interesting, the attempt, one could indeed say, of maximal Hegelianization of Marxian dialectics, and it is quite peculiar that precisely in this book, the closest connection was forged between apparently idealist theses and what are officially professed to be extreme communist positions, ... Let me say straight away that the universality which is derived from the concept of reification precisely in this book, and the transmission of the problem of the concepts of reification and alienation to the broader field of epistemology are eminently fruitful, and that hardly anyone who has never once learned what happens to the concept of reification in this book by Lukács can seriously reflect upon questions of dialectics. On the other hand, let me say that precisely the overdone Hegelianism, or in other words, what one could call the idealistic extreme of this book, led to the highly outlandish construction of the Communist Party, which in Lukács' later works is still to some extent identified with the world spirit, along with all the disastrous political consequences you know of, end quote. Adorno. In a 1968 seminar transcript, Adorno brings up history and class consciousness once again, Here Adorno develops the argument that while Lukács, quote, believed in 1922 to 23 that revolution was imminent, he had not really comprehended the problem of essence and appearance, of objective class situation and subjective class consciousness. The accusation of idealism refers above all to the fact that Lukács, following Hegel, apparently believed that the Hegelian world spirit had possessed the proletariat. Moreover, because its turn had objectively come, the proletariat would automatically also become the subject of history and of revolution, end quote. Adorno is just as unwilling to participate in this idealization as Adorno is to abstain from the concept of class. For, quote, neither should the proletariat, in the sense of a straightforward identification of subjective and objective situation, be fetishized, not the category of, quote, class, simply abandoned, end quote. Adorno's early work largely adopts Lukácsian social critique's focus on the commodity form. As will now be seen, this is made evident, quote, by both Adorno's 1936 article on jazz and 1938 on the fetish character of music and the regression of listening, two works of music criticism in which Adorno becomes the first Marxist theoretician, following Lukács, to harness the possibilities of commodity form analysis, end quote. Breuer, 1985. That's the end of Chapter 2 of Adorno's Critique of Political Economy by Dirk Braunstein, translated by Adam Baltner. Thank you so much for listening.